Good afternoon. Always amazes me how I say good afternoon or good morning and the room goes quiet. Once again, welcome to one of the research talks at the University of Waterloo. This is our final research talk for 2016. They will be continuing in the new year, but this is the last one for this year. I'd also like to thank people for taking the time out to come today. We're heading into a very busy season. The holiday season is approaching rather more quickly than we might like it to approach. And that other good time within the academic calendar, which are final exams for this semester, are also in the offing, so everyone is looking forward to that, I'm sure. I really look forward to these research seminars. It's an opportunity to come together and to actually discuss the research that we do within the institution. We are blessed at the University of Waterloo with a very high number of very accomplished colleagues who have a very high profile outside of the university, but often I don't think we tend to celebrate that internally as sufficiently as we probably should. So this is an opportunity to do that. Today's session is absolutely no different than the others that we've had of bringing high-profile colleagues to your attention within the university. Today we're going to be hearing from Professor Jeff Fong, who is the principal investigator of the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project, known as the ITC Project. Jeff is a professor in the Department of Psychology in the Faculty of Arts. He's also cross-appointed into Applied Health Sciences, and he's also a senior investigator at the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. Jeff received his Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Stanford, PhD in Social Psychology from the University of Michigan, and held faculty positions at Northwestern and Princeton before moving to the University of Waterloo. Jeff is very highly published. He's published over 270 journal articles and presented over 500 papers at scientific meetings around the world. He's also very active on the speaking circuit in terms of raising awareness of the research area that he de facto leads worldwide. Jeff and I were just joking before I started that we've been colleagues for more than 20 years, but I have never actually heard him speak on his science before. So that goes to that comment I make about we don't do enough of this internal to the university. Jeff has been very well recognized for his excellent activities, recipient of many honors and recognitions, including the Luther Terry Award from the American Cancer Society, Top Canadian Achievement in Health Research from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and Canadian Medical Association Journal. He was also recognized by the World Health Organization with an award for World No Tobacco Day. Jeff has had a very successful year on the funding front. Anybody that's looking to do graduate work, he's got money. He received a renewal of a CIHR grant of $11 million and over $8 million from the U.S. National Cancer Institute, both for his work associated with ICT. I think it's fair to say that the work that Jeff does focuses on combining the theory and practice in psychology with traditional epidemiological survey methods to evaluate the impact of tobacco control policies. This is a truly global initiative. We talk about that at Waterloo a lot, but this is one instance where I have absolutely no qualms about saying that this is a global initiative. Jeff and the ICT Project team conduct large-scale surveys of tobacco use in countries that are inhabited by over 50% of the world's population, 60% of the world's smokers, and 70% of the world tobacco users. Global initiative. I could go on at length, but you don't want to hear me go on at length. You want to hear Jeff talk.
Go on.
So with no further ado, Jeff, the floor is yours, sir.
Okay. Thank you so much, George. And George is right. I mean, I give a lot of talks, probably about 20 a year in different countries and so on, and I never talk here. So it's really wonderful to see in the audience the people in my department, the people who used to be in my department, members of our ITC team, the Office of Research that has been so wonderful and so supportive, as well as the faculties of arts, AHS, and also math, the three faculties where the ITC Project has faculty and research funding. And so when we started this in 2002, I was determined to make sure that in every way this would be a multi-faculty endeavor. And indeed, we have done that through sharing of indirect costs and other sorts of things like that. But really also in the way that we interact in the university to promote the idea that multidisciplinary approaches to research, especially in the domain I'm going to be talking about, is something that is to be promoted and to be cherished. So let me talk, as usual, I have way too many slides, but that's okay. As it gets close, I can skip some. But what I want to do today is to talk about the ITC project as an example of how research evidence can potentially make a difference in global policies, and to perhaps meet in some ways the objectives of research to policy. So let's get started right now. We know that smoking is dangerous. If we examine smoking in Canada, what's extraordinary about this is that people don't know that still smoking, tobacco use is the #1 preventable cause of death and disease in Canada, still, and going to be for the next at least couple of decades perhaps. So right now, we know that smoking rates have gone down. 13% of Canadians now smoke, down from 15% in 2013, but there hasn't been any change among young adults and youth. That is the feeder population for the tobacco industry. 46,500 people approximately die every year in Canada, by far the #1 preventable cause of death and disease. There are statistics that are astonishing with respect to the total costs in a year, including huge amounts in direct healthcare costs. Now, what's extraordinary is that 1/2 to 2/3 of regular smokers will die of a smoking-related cause. And for those who die, it's well over a decade loss of life. 1/2 to 2/3 of regular smokers. And contrasted with that, 90% of Canadian smokers, and in fact pretty close to 90% in all of the high-income countries that we have studied, agree or disagree, agree strongly that if I had to do it over again, I would not have started smoking. In other words, despite the extraordinary statistics on how dangerous this is, 90% of smokers that are continuing regret ever having started smoking, which puts a lie to the tobacco industry insistence of the happy and satisfied smoker. The statistics, I could rattle on and on about statistics, but this is one that's very striking, which is cancer deaths among American women. And if you see this over time from 1969 to pretty close to the present, you see two types of cancers that are represented here. The red one is breast, and you can see that it's gone from about 30,000 to its current level about 40,000. So a modest increase. But look at lung and bronchus, which is the purview and domain of smoking. 85 to 90% of such cancers are smoking related. Look at the extraordinary increase there, so that right now it's about 80%, 70 to 80% higher than the prevalent, the incidence, in this case the death rate, due to breast cancer. Now, pause for a moment and consider this extraordinary epidemic among women, entirely preventable, whereas what do we know about breast cancer? So that extraordinary, I don't know how many of you know of this, I mean, perhaps the people who study cancer epidemiology know this, but very few people out there in the world know about the problem of smoking and how it has overcome breast cancer as far as the leading cause of death, cancer. So whatever the situation is within high-income countries, it's far worse throughout the globe. 1.1 to 1.3 billion people smoke. In the 20th century, there were 100 million deaths due to tobacco. That is going to increase tenfold in the 21st century. 1 billion people are projected to die of tobacco-related diseases, and which is extraordinary, and about 80% of the deaths are going to be born in low and middle income countries, LMICs. About 6 million die this year, and that's going to increase as we progress through the century. Smoking tobacco causes 1/6 of all non-communicable diseases worldwide. It's the only risk factor that causes all 4 leading NCDs. And then to summarize all of this, the WHO says that tobacco is the leading preventable cause of death and disability in the world. No doubt about that. So there are a couple of quotations that I'm going to be interspersing throughout this talk. The first to sort of characterize the nature of the tobacco epidemic. Here's the first one. Tobacco is the most effective agent of death ever developed and deployed on a worldwide scale. This was said by John Seffrin, who's the former president CEO of American Cancer Society. What's really striking about this is the use of words here. He uses the words effective agent, developed and deployed. Those are human attributes. You wouldn't talk about malaria or polio in this way. And yet, Seffrin does this, and it really captures the nature of what we're talking about with respect to tobacco. And to demonstrate this in an extraordinary way, Credit Suisse recently put out the long-run performance of industries in the United States. So if you invested $1 in 1900, where are you now in 2010? So there are a whole bunch of things here: paper, coal, utilities market, the stock market, household goods, and so on, telecommunications, et cetera. So you can see the growth rate here. Now, there are certain ones that I want to call your attention to. The first one is the stock market. If you put $1 in the stock market in 1900, and who didn't do that, right now you would have 38,255. That's a 10.1% annual rate over 110 years. That's pretty admirable, right? And so I'm going to tell you something about, when you learn this stuff in grade school or whatever, remember the magic of compounding? Remember that phrase, the magic of compounding? I'm going to show you an extraordinary example of this. Okay, this is a 10.1% annual rate here. Okay, the other one is that I want, of course, talk about is tobacco. And that's a 15.3% annual rate. Look how much you get. $1 invested in the tobacco industry in 1900 gets you $6,280,237. And I'll bet no one's calibrated to this, even the mathematicians among us. But 10% annual rate versus 15% annual rate gives you that incredible difference there. So you can use this in your classes. This is a logarithmic scale, right? So it doesn't really demonstrate how incredibly different this is, how much better tobacco is. So I happen to do it this way, on a linear scale. Stock market and tobacco. Okay, so we know this is the root of why the tobacco industry and the tobacco epidemic are so intrinsically related. Why Seffrin talked about the human attributes of the tobacco epidemic. This is borne out in this. It's the most profitable industry ever in history. Before, what's his name? Before Warren Buffett found Bill Gates, he commented on tobacco. He said, "Oh, tobacco? Cigarettes as an investment? A penny to make, $1 to sell, and it's addictive." Right? That's the whole story. So we are dealing with the consequences of a human, financially driven machine that has led to the extraordinary tragedies and will continue to do so on health and welfare. So, given the massiveness of the situation with respect to tobacco use, the only feasible way to combat such a threat is through population level interventions. I'm sorry, I mean, there might be some vaccine or whatever and so on, but I'll tell you this, nothing can compete with the power and potential of population level interventions. And so let me just show you something about the power of these interventions, but with respect to policies, but let me just give you a context here for understanding population level interventions. That is, interventions that are played out over entire countries, entire societies, perhaps even globally. So here is the cumulative tobacco deaths from a century period of time from 1950 to 2050. And you can see here that the estimation is in that century period of time, 100 years, 520 million people will be dead because of tobacco use. So as we examine the potential of these population interventions, we think about it in this way. This is cumulative curve, so it's never going to go down, but let's try to reduce it, bend it down so that at the end of that 100 years, we don't have as many deaths. So what are the factors that will determine how much we can bend down that curve? There are two of them. One is timing, and the other one is strength. All things being equal, if you have an intervention that's played out earlier in the time frame, in the same way as in physics with a flexible rod, you bend it down with leverage, right? In fact, I'm sure there's even equations that equate the concepts. You will have greater impact on bending down that curve. And the second one, of course, is strength. The harder you bend down at whatever point you're at, the more you're going to bend down that curve. So you put these two together, and if you have a relatively small effect size intervention that's played out late, implemented late, you don't have that much ability to bend down that curve. But if you have a strong intervention and you implement it earlier on in the sequence, that is as soon as possible, then you can achieve a much greater bending down of that curve. So to boil it all down, the key to combating the tobacco epidemic is to identify strong evidence-based measures that will reduce tobacco-caused death and harm, and then to implement them as soon as possible. It's in this context that the tactics of the tobacco industry, bargaining with governments, bargaining with society to say, oh, yeah, we'll do that implementation, but let's give us another 6 months or give us another year. For every little bit that they delay is more profits for them, more deaths for society. So, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the world's first ever treaty negotiated under the World Health Organization, is an extraordinary event because it has mobilized the entire world toward doing something about the global tobacco epidemic. It came into force in 2005. It was negotiated and adopted in 2003. It took a little while for 40 countries to become parties to this. And now it's ratified, it's not quite technically right. There are 180 parties to the FCTC, 179 countries, and then the European Union. So there are 180 parties altogether. It's multi-sectoral because it recognizes the fact that tobacco is not just a health-related issue. It combines aspects of the economic systems with business, commerce, with all sorts of sectors of society and government. So it recognizes that from the very start. It also includes the broad range of tobacco control policies that we here in Canada and in many countries that are high income have known about, have experienced, including strong pictorial warnings, comprehensive smoke-free laws, higher taxes to reduce demand, bans and restrictions on marketing, support for cessation, measures to reduce smuggling, illicit trade, and tobacco product regulation. A very important feature of this treaty is the last one, which is the tobacco industry must be prevented from influencing policies and measures. This is an extraordinary addition to a worldwide treaty because oftentimes, as you may know from treaties, that, gee, if you're regulating an industry, don't they get a place at the table? This treaty says all contacts with the tobacco industry must be very transparent, so there's no undue influence. So I would argue that this is the greatest disease prevention initiative in history given the magnitude of the global tobacco epidemic, the #1 preventable cause of death and disease in the world, an epidemic that's going to claim 1 billion lives, this is an approach signed on by 180 countries to provide, to create measures in each of those countries to reduce that global threat. So, what's really interesting about the FCTC from a research point of view or an evidence point of view is that it is indeed an evidence-based treaty. It says so in the foreword. In fact, if you look at the text, the word evidence is mentioned 5 times, the word scientific is mentioned 13 times, and then effective or effectiveness is mentioned 28 times. There are extraordinary linkages to the idea of science and research to inform and to accelerate and strengthen the FCTC. And we know, actually, that there is some growing evidence. This is something that Shannon Gravely has led, a research scientist with us at the ITC Project. We just submitted it to Lancet this week, demonstrating that the more strong implementations of the treaty provisions of the FCTC in countries, that is associated with a significant decline in prevalence. So, and this, it was just actually we presented this last week, 2 weeks ago at the 7th Conference of the Parties, which is the biannual gathering of the parties of the FCTC, where they move forward the treaty. So that was just in India. So what defines whether a treaty is actually effective? And in global governance, a key criterion is whether parties have met their obligations. So there's something called implementation review mechanism, and that asks us, how many measures have the parties implemented, how strong are these measures, and so on. So there are examples of this in sort of, not evaluating, but sort of keeping track of how a treaty is doing. The parties are supposed to report to the Secretariat of the treaty what they've done. The WHO actually has a policy monitoring system where they keep track of what laws have been passed and make some judgment about how strong those might be, and there are civil society shadow monitoring efforts. But this is really seldom used. If you look across many different treaties, they oftentimes don't really have a review mechanism. They just kind of leave it up to the nations, the countries, to really police themselves. So let's see how the FCTC has done. By 2012, 1 billion people, 16% of the world's population, were covered by complete smoke-free legislation. And that was in 2012. There's a provision in the FCTC where it's either, I can't remember, 3 or 5 years after coming into force that all nations should be doing this. Oops, really bad. Only 16% have implemented this. And then by 2014, it only went up to 18%. So warning about the dangers of tobacco, large graphic warnings. 14% in 2012 and 20% in 2014. It's a fair bit higher than that now, but still there was an obligation after 3 years for all countries, under all parties, to implement these. We're only at 20%, maybe 25 to 30% by now. Woefully slow. But the situation is even worse than just looking at the low percentage of countries that have engaged in strong implementation. Because if you look on the ground to find out whether or not these implementations are actually effective, you find some major disappointments. So to examine this, consider what happens from the path from passing the law to its actual impact. So a law is passed, regulations are created, a law is implemented, communicated, enforced, complied with, and so on, and then that leads to the question, how effective is this law on actual people, those that are living and dying, those that are dying of tobacco use? There's an extraordinary pathway with a lot of many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip, as the old proverb goes. And that's what happens in this particular situation. So we have data for this. In our project in India, with 4 states in India, 8,000 people altogether, we found that there was extremely low, let me back up. There was a very strong law on paper about comprehensive smoke-free in India. It was passed in 2008, but when we went, and this was 2.5 years later, we found that only 35%, barely over 1/3, of smokers in Maharashtra, where Mumbai is, were aware that there was even a law. In Madhya Pradesh, one of the other states that we're in India, only 18% of smokers were aware. So that kind of puts a ceiling on what you would expect of the effectiveness of this very strong law on paper. So all the monitoring efforts, all of the textual analysis, which is really the center part of how policy people examine in global governance whether or not the parties are doing anything about the treaty. They say success, we say sorry. There's a huge gap between the success on paper of a law and the actual impact on real people that are living and dying. A very strong law on paper does not guarantee that it will have impact. You do a legislative analysis, that's potential impact, not actual impact. So, there's a second, and I'm now talking in the realm of global governance and how we evaluate treaties, but there's something called performance review, which is basically evaluation. And are these implementations having their desired effect? So, in the language of where I come from, psychosocial, psychology, public health, really its performance review is equal to policy evaluation. So we want to go back to the roots of the FCTC, and this is the objective of the FCTC Article 3. And you can see from this that the objective of the treaty is to protect present and future generations from the devastating effects of tobacco consumption, et cetera, and you're going to implement these measures, and that's going to, in order to reduce continually and substantially the prevalence of tobacco use and exposure to tobacco smoke. That's in the objective. So if the standard for whether or not this treaty is meeting its objective, whether nations, countries have passed laws, where are we to the extent that there's a gap between the laws that are passed and the actual impact on the people? So therefore, the question of is the FCTC meeting its ultimate objective, we need to go beyond that, the standard, and we need to say what kind of evidence do we need to assess real progress aligned with the objective of the treaty. So I've been involved in a couple of things, initiatives that may bear on this issue. There was a decision made at the COP6 in Russia where there was a decision that was introduced by Norway and it was adopted, and it says there's going to be an impact assessment of the WHO FCTC here, and that the purpose will be to assess and examine the impact of the FCTC on implementation of tobacco control measures. Okay, that's where it was in the draft version, but it didn't reach the floor because I worked with the Norway delegation in drafting this. And I said, wait a second, you can't just stop there because that's just textual analysis. You got to add this. What's the effect of the FCTC and on the effectiveness of its implementation? So I stuck that in the decision. It came to the floor and it was adopted. So that was the foundation for the impact assessment. What has the FCTC done over its first 10 years on actually doing something about the tobacco epidemic? So we were involved heavily in the impact assessment work of the expert group. I was one of the 7 members of this group, and our wonderful ITC staff prepared this over a period of many months, a global evidence review of the 17 parts of the FCTC where assessment of impact even made any sense. So that's available actually on the FCTC website. So the global evidence, the summary of our findings, it's that it's been an important drive. Yeah, it has increased implementation. It has, there are other things, and then highest level implementation of the articles is the most effective way to go. So the question I want to return to is, why has implementation been so slow and in many cases below the standards set by the FCTC guidelines? Here's the second quotation. Tobacco use is unlike other threats to global health. Infectious diseases do not employ multinational public relations firms. There are no front groups to promote the spread of cholera. Mosquitoes have no lobbyists. And we see in every way how the tobacco industry has tried to thwart the treaty, but they couldn't thwart the treaty itself because it's just too transparent. But now that everything is about implementation, how are the countries going to actually be doing things? That's where the tobacco industry is the strongest. And they have done so in so many ways through explicit and implicit political influence. But I want to, as a researcher, I want to talk a little bit about how they distort science. So they have created front groups to cast doubt on the evidence of the harms of smoking and then of secondhand smoke. They have payment to neutral scientists. They've set up all kinds of, supposedly, grassroots movements, right? The so-called AstroTurf, right? Fake grassroots. Movements and so on. And I mean, they even created, they created their own journals. To put scientific work into to question the impact of secondhand smoke and so on. So you may know about this book and also the movie Merchants of Doubt. Doubt is Our Product is from Philip Morris International's or Philip Morris's industry documents. That's exactly what they're trying to do. And of course we see this with Exxon and other kinds of latter-day instantiations of this kind of strategy of casting doubt on something that all scientists think is obvious. So for us, the fight against the industry is fought on the battlefield of evidence. What evidence do we have that these policies really do work? What evidence do we have that addresses industry claims that policies won't work or they will lead to actual negative impact, like it would cripple the economy, it would increase illicit trade, policies won't work, or even boomerang. All kinds of claims there. These are empirical claims that must be dealt with empirically. There is an essential need, therefore, for research that evaluates the impact of the FCTC. Now, of course, there are challenges to evaluating policies. You can't really do randomized trials, but it is possible to load up an observational study in many ways, bells and whistles, to increase internal validity, increase the likelihood that what you're looking at is an estimate of the actual policy impact as opposed to something else. You can do natural experiments, quasi-experiments. So if you're evaluating a policy in one country, you got to have other countries in order to compare it over time. So that's a quasi-experiment. You need international studies. You also need the common methods and measures across countries, and you need a focus of impact on individuals over time. The longitudinal component plus the cross-country comparisons make for a very nice way of greatly increasing internal validity, therefore having the study tell you something about what's really going on with these policies. So that's the starting point for creating the ITC project. We started off in the first 4 countries, Canada, US, Australia, and UK, and by now we're up to 28 countries. This is the last time we kind of all got together, sort of. 65 at the time, over 100 investigators from 17 countries there, and we have there are many of our team gatherings in Kenya and China and Zambia and in the Netherlands and the UK, the EU. We have, many other pictures of that. The mission of our ITC project is to conduct and disseminate high-quality research to promote evidence-based approaches to reducing tobacco use throughout the world. The key features, we care about the science. It's the first ever international cohort study of tobacco of any kind. And we focus on dissemination. We have produced over 60 national reports and other kinds of plain language reviews of our evidence, and directly countering the myths of the tobacco industry. And we focus on collaboration and building research capacity. We have 150 investigators over 28 countries, and so on. We do surveys. We do probably the most extensive surveys ever done in this area, and we do them in all 28 countries. We have a unique focus on policy impact. We have 150 questions specifically on each of those policies in general. We also have a conceptual model that drives everything that we do. We believe that if there's a mediational model, how do policies work to ultimately influence behavior? We have hypothesized policy pathways through that to get to the actual change in behavior, and we use those in all of our surveys. We also have a possibility of looking at the moderators to examine whether inequities of health due to tobacco use can be alleviated through policies. I'm just talking about the surveys, but we also have experimental studies, and we also have about 20,000 packs of cigarettes that are in frozen storage in Roswell Park, and we actually do product testing about nitrosamines and heavy metals and all sorts of things. So I'm only talking about our surveys here. We're also in the top 6 of the top 10 countries with respect to smokers. There, and of course, altogether, we have we're in 50% of the world's population, 60% of the world's smokers, over 70% of the world's tobacco users. We have evaluations across many different domains. Here's just a partial list here, and you can see from this that we have the ability, because some, let's say within warning labels, some of them are from text to text, some of them are from text to graphic, some of them are from graphic to larger graphic. So we have dose differences in policies in entire countries. So we can do, because we have all the same measures over time and with a cohort design, we can actually examine across entire countries dose response effects in the magnitude of the strength of these policies in all of these domains. We also have kind of written the book on how to evaluate tobacco control policies with this handbook we put together through International Agency for Research on Cancer. And let me just give you some examples of what we've done here. This is from Canada, and Canada was the first country to do graphic warning labels back in 2000, 2001. And when we started in 2002 and 2003, we have this measure called the Label Impact Index. And you can see from this that this has gone down over time, because just like any communication, the more you see the same thing over time, it's going to have less of an effect, right? It's the cognitive health communication version of habituation. So then that's where we were in 2011. So then Health Canada had announced mysteriously that they had been trying to revise the warning labels for about, I can't remember, a year and a half or 2 years. So that went in, and so I testified with some others in the House of Commons Health Select Committee, and then I showed them this graph. And then I'm not saying this had an influence, because you never know with politicians, but I mean, really, they won't ever admit it. But 3 weeks later, the health minister said, oh, we weren't really planning on canceling the revision. Yeah, we're going ahead with this. Of course we are. So indeed, what happens afterwards is that it bounces back up. It doesn't bounce back as far because the effect size of going from graphic to a new set of graphic and 75% isn't as great as from text to graphic. So I want to focus on China a little bit. It's a huge problem, 300 million smokers in China. 53% of men, half of men smoke in China, only 2.4% of women. A real problem because the tobacco industry is state-owned. The ultimate conflict of interest. So if you go down, and this is the Beijing subway, so remember, half of men smoke, 1/2 to 2/3 of them are going to die. That means 2/3 times 1/2, 1/3 of all men you see walking down the street, or in this case the subway, are going to be dead. So those are the ones that are going to be dead. I know, I have to have some way so that doesn't evoke laughter, because this is an extraordinary tragedy. I got to have a different graphic for this. I'll work on that. I don't want the people laughing, oh, look, they're all going to die. This is something that is extraordinary. 1/3 of the men that you see walking down the street are going to be dead. Average loss of life of over a decade in China. This is the organization of our ITC China project. It's very complicated here, but let me just tell you this. In all 28 countries, we got something like this going on. We have, there used to be 7 sampling sites, and now we're doing 10 sites. 5 of them are cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and some of them are rural areas because people really don't know anything about tobacco use in rural settings, much less policy impact. So we're doing that now in China. Just to give you some examples of this, we did a national report. We released it at the Chinese Communist Party School. I have to say that very carefully because when I say party school, you might be thinking about Western. But actually, it's really Communist Party school. So, and this is, of course, if you know this, this is the extraordinary, this is the proving and training ground for all of the government in China. And so we did a study, we went there was a set of experts there to hear the 6-month-long study that the party school had done on the tobacco problem in China. And we knew this was significant because the party school would not have done this type of study on such a sensitive issue if it wasn't for the leadership and encouragement of the president of party school. At the time, it was Xi Jinping, who's now the president and general party's secretary of China. He's the leader of China. So we knew a couple of years before he assumed power that there was going to be some move toward stronger tobacco control measures. So I'm just going to talk about this, breeze through these. There's an extraordinary problem of secondhand smoke here, and recent smoke-free laws in China. There is no national law, but there's one being drafted right now. And it's currently being debated. I mean, literally in the next month or so, they're going to be announcing what's going to happen. Beijing implemented a comprehensive smoke-free law. It was the strongest smoke-free law in China, and just passed a couple weeks ago in Shanghai. They were wavering, but they actually went for comprehensive smoke-free laws here. We've done work with WHO China on this report, and if you look over time, you can see that smoking in restaurants has gone down somewhat, right? So it looks like a kind of a success. It's about the same as that of the rural areas there, if you can see that. However, if you compare it to different countries, which is why ITC is really nice because you can compare across different countries, you see where China is with respect to smoking in restaurants, 82% is the highest except for Bangladesh. So, these are all ITC data. We have been tracking the impact of smoke-free laws to reduce smoking in key areas like restaurants. So Ireland, they said it would never work in Ireland. 84% of restaurants had smoking in it, and then after the law, 2 and 1%. Then Scotland, 60% to 1%. France, Simone de Beauvoir, and Sartre, and they'll never work there. Yes, it worked. 69% to 2%, 1%, et cetera. You can see all the successes. Here's a really great one. Mexico City has a stronger law than Mexico other. So you have within the same country, you've got a dose-response effect there. And then even the tiny island nation of Mauritius there. So, and then Korea, more recently, it's gone down. They finally implemented that. This is China. So putting that in the context of all the other countries, if they did comprehensive smoke-free law, it would look kind of like that. Now, the initial data from Beijing is it goes down significantly. So we know this. We've pounded at the government with these data. WHO's been pounding at them. But it gets even better. That support for the law among smokers, because governments always say, they'll never accept it, and so on. Well, yes, they will. Ireland, Scotland, UK, France, even Germany and Netherlands, which aren't quite fans, they've gone up, but not as much as those other countries here. The red dots are the support among smokers. Would you support an entirely smoke-free law in bars and pubs? Okay, so you can see that, and it went up after implementation, but the red dots are before a law was passed. Here's where China is now, 35%. It's way, way higher than any of the other countries where ultimately a successful smoke-free law was implemented. The government has no leg to stand on when they insist that the smokers would not accept this. Okay, so we've done a lot with WHO on warning labels. I'm not going to go into that. We've also helped the CDC, China CDC, make a submission to both houses of government, the State Council and then the National People's Congress, we basically wrote the China CDC submission to those bodies of the government. Now skipping here to, there's an endless kind of supply of how the industry has tried to fool people into thinking that cigarettes aren't so bad. Here are some of the old-time advertising. Here are some of the positive health impact of cigarettes. I like that one. And then, of course, with Thanksgiving of yesterday, I guess in the U.S., for digestion's sake, smoked camels. There are also product innovations, and this is something that, you know, the famous Kent micronite filter and so on. Yeah, right. They continue that by these kinds of marketing tools, which are going to become gone in Canada. Here's some packaging for women, but with plain packaging, what's happened, Australia was the first country to say, enough with all of this marketing on the pack. You're not going to have any branding showing. You're going to have your name, and you're going to have the warning label, but nothing else of that. There have been challenges from international trade agreements, from its weird, the dragon, and the dragons coming after Australia here, including at the World Trade Organization, where 4 countries issued a challenge to Australia for their plain packaging laws. And then I was part of the Australia expert team here, and this is from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Health and Attorney General's offices at the WTO at the hearing here. And I wanted to, now I hope this works, but...
because you will never guess who else is coming after Australia.
3 governments, Honduras, the Dominican Republic and Ukraine, have filed complaints with the World Trade Organization against Australia's plain packaging laws.
That's right, Ukraine is charging Australia with hurting its tobacco exports, something which was a bit of a surprise to a Ukrainian member of parliament.
When I first read about the position of the government, it seems to be a joke, because we have a zero trade exchange between Australia and Ukraine of any tobacco goods.
Zero trade, zero. So Ukraine is inserting themselves into something they have nothing to do with.
Okay. So anyway, that's and we have all sorts of ITC evidence supporting Australia, plain packaging law, and also we made a submission to Health Canada, and we were pleased to see just a couple days ago that Bill S5 has come out. We're going to have plain packaging next year sometime. Uruguay has also been challenged, poor little Uruguay. PMI, Philip Morris International's annual revenues is something like 3-4 times that of Uruguay's GDP per year. So we have this.
Uruguay started introducing increasingly larger health warnings. Smoking rates dropped, and Uruguayans liked the laws, with 68% of smokers
ITC data
saying that they should be stronger. But just because they wanted it hasn't stopped PMI from suing them for the past 5 years.
Okay. Oh, sorry. And we have data. This is something that Shannon led, where do 50% warning labels when you increase the size to 80%. Does it work? PMI said, there's no way. It doesn't work. And that was, you know, because countries supposedly can't pass health policies if they don't work. Well, turns out it works. And we submitted those to the tribunal in Washington last summer, and they had no response to this. Okay. So let me wrap up here. These are our new directions with e-cigarettes. We're very interested in finding out what's going on with policies. There are all kinds of data, some of which are really ridiculously presented and so on, and others that aren't so bad. But everyone's scrambling to try to figure out what policies should be on e-cigarettes. So we have, I'm not going to go into this, but we have a model that actually examines it, and we have measures of it, and we're using that in our new research on e-cigarettes. I'm not going to go over this. So from our new grant from the U.S. National Cancer Institute, there are 5 interlinked projects. that are going to examine the impact of policies of different types in 4 countries, and then we're also using that in many of our other ITC countries, to find out what in the world is going on with respect to policies. How do policies actually influence the process by which e-cigarettes are used, quitting, whether they promote dual use versus quitting altogether, and so on. So we're going to be going through that. We're also examining things like nicotine reduction as a possible strategy for reducing the addictiveness of cigarettes. And we're also examining menthol bans and other additive bans as well, some of the more interesting policies in that. So conclusions are that rigorous evaluation is necessary to accelerate and strengthen the efforts to combat the global tobacco epidemic. And the ITC was the first and still the only research project in the world to actually evaluate FCTC policies across different countries. It's essential to disseminate and communicate the research findings to governments and advocates, and we're using a multidisciplinary approach among our many investigators. We've got probably 10 distinct academic disciplines represented here, and then also because the rules of causality do not vary across domain or content, that the kind of establishment of our evaluation methods can easily be transported to other domains, and that's been done. So here's our ITC website, and here are our sponsors and our research organizations, and I want to really thank, how come it's not advancing? Come on, I have another slide. Yes. I really want to thank the Office of Research and then our major funders here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Well, it certainly is a pleasure to watch somebody who is very keen about what they do. I'd also comment that perhaps a 1-hour seminar was not where we should have gone with this, but maybe a half-day workshop might have been more the drill. We have time for a couple of questions, and there is a mechanism to the questions. In order for the questions to be broadcast to the webcast, you have to use a microphone. So I saw Mike's hand first. I'm going to give him the microphone, and then we'll go from there.
Yes, thanks, Jeff. In Canada, we have the unique problem of gray market cigarettes. And I was wondering if you would comment at all on how their prevalence, I understand it's more than half the cigarettes in Canada or something approaching that is actually gray market cigarettes. How that affects smoking cessation policies and whether or not we have a path forward to deal with this.
Well, let me just say, first of all, that although illicit is a problem, it's not as high as 50%. The people who say it's 50% are the tobacco industry, and they have been known to be quite awful and quite dishonest with respect to how they calculate that. In Australia, they tried to make a claim that plain packaging increased illicit, but even their KPMG actually had to, who did the report for the industry, actually had to go publicly against their taskmasters in that. So we find it's, I can't remember what it is, about 25% in Ontario, but the other provinces is very low. So we don't have as much of a problem. Having said that, of course, any kind of illicit trade does put a crimp on it, especially in the domain of tax and price, where people can escape, not just by switching down to a cheaper brand, but also getting it from a different source. So we are concerned about that. There's actually a part of the FCTC that deals with that, having to do with monitoring and track and trace and so on. So that is a policy, a domain that is really being worked on right now at the global level. In some countries, it's far worse than in Canada.
Next question, Bruce, and then back down here.
Thanks a lot for your presentation, very interesting. But I was wondering if investor-state dispute resolution procedures apply to tobacco labeling. You talked a little bit about it. I don't think Uruguay is covered by investor-state dispute resolution guidelines, but anyway, if they are, then...
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you mentioned this. I mean, there are probably 3,000 bilateral investment treaties of some type throughout the world, and they have what's known as the ISDS, the Investor-State Dispute Settlement Procedure. That means that a company can come after a government for infringing on trade issue, however it's defined in that treaty. NAFTA has it. In fact, we have evidence that when Alan Rock, when he was health minister, wanted to ban light mild, he posted an intent to regulate, but then was somehow dissuaded from that, possibly from the fact that Philip Morris in the US was going to come after them with a claim to the tribunal on NAFTA under an ISDS. These things are really horrible if looked at in a certain way, and I look at it from a health perspective, also, of course, the sovereignty of governments. And it's really quite striking that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they had an ISDS just like everyone else. But there is actually in the working draft, who knows what's actually going to happen with it now, the ISDS excludes tobacco. So it's not that tobacco is excluded from the provisions of TPP, but that particular ISDS does not apply to tobacco products. There are all sorts of technical details I don't want to get into, but there is a growing recognition of the problem of that. Whether it's going to, how far that's going to get with respect to future, agreements, unclear. But it's actually quite nice that along with the whole idea that health has a place, when you're examining trade policies, that the actual remedy process, the ISDS, is being questioned now. I think that can only be good.
Last question right here.
Jeff, thanks very much. This was wonderful, a wonderful talk. It was good to kind of hear in a more formal way what you're doing. I have perhaps a rhetorical question, and it was motivated by a visit I made to the University of Texas a few months ago. And this is a campus, by the way, where students can carry concealed loaded weapons into their lecture halls.
Right.
But the entire University of Texas campus is smoke-free. In other words, nowhere on the campus can you smoke. And I know this is a movement in a number of American universities. I'm not aware of any Canadian universities, however, that have really gone this direction. I'm wondering, given the fact that you're here, whether Waterloo could actually be sort of a leader in establishing a fully smoke, and what that means is not just in buildings, but the entire campus. And I'm just curious about sort of the nature of leadership of universities, particularly with young people, in engaging in this kind of a problem.
It's a fantastic question, Craig. I thought that there was going to be a policy that either is or coming into place. Do you know? Yeah.
The smoking policy was reviewed last year and updated to say not 10 meters away from the building on campus.
But it's not campus free. Yeah, it's
The policy affects campus, not 10 meters
No.
from the building on campus.
no. Actually, there are
Campus-wide everywhere.
they're right.
This is what Texas has done. I know we're trying to do it
Right.
at SFU with no success.
Right, exactly, and that would be really interesting. I mean, there's some student groups, but I don't like leave the pack behind and so on. But I think that it would be really nice to mobilize for that, because I think that's a very important, and it makes a very important health point, as well as galvanizing people to recognize the threat of tobacco that still exists. So I think that's a great idea.
Thank you very kindly. I think the one university that has is Dalhousie. They brought it in, but I think they may have either rescinded it or modified it because they were getting into situations of conflict over enforcement. And I think they were that was the issue that I heard, but that's ancient data now. I mean, that's about 1.5 years old. Sir, thank you very kindly.
Thank you very much.
I'm not going to continue on other than to say that check the Office of Research website for the next event of this nature, which will be happening in January, and we'll see you in the new year.
Great.